Christine E. On democratizing American philanthropy, not since the Gilded Age, the same era that witnessed the rise of so many major American foundations, has the United States faced a wider divide between the wealthy and the poor. According to the Internal Revenue Service, from 1992 to 2000, the average income of the 400 richest Americans grew from $46.8 million to $174 million. Meanwhile, the poor are becoming poorer. The 2000 U.S. Census reports that 12% of the American population lives below the federal poverty level. While government spending on military expenditures reaches record highs and the tax base continues to shrink, a permanent and expanding class of Americans lives in extreme poverty. 2 middle-class families are also feeling the pinch of mounting debt and lessening economic and social security. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, the middle class, statistically characterized as those in the middle fifth income bracket, had an average after-tax income of $41,900 in 2000, a 15% rise. In 1979, the wealthiest 1% of Americans had just under half the after-tax income of the poorest 40% of Americans. In 2000, the richest 1% of Americans had more money to spend after taxes than the bottom 40%. Yet even as this crisis escalates, at every level of government we see harsh cuts in education, health care, and other essential human services. As federal, state, and local funds dry up, the public turns to philanthropy and charities to pick up where government has left off. Conservatives, for example, slash federal welfare benefits to fund marriage promotion as a poverty prevention policy targeting poor women, then call on churches, nonprofits, and volunteers to help people without food, homes, jobs, or health care under the mantle of compassionate conservatism. 5. Many Americans are seduced by the idea that piecemeal voluntary efforts can somehow replace a systematic public approach to eliminating poverty. But this reasoning is based on the inherent falsehood that scarcity rather than inequality is at the root of these persisting social and economic problems. This worldview nurtures a culture of noblesse oblige, the belief that the wealthy and privileged are obliged to help those less fortunate without examining how that wealth was created, or the dangerous implications of conceding such power to the wealthy. But that same reliance on the generosity of the wealthy poses grave threats to democracy because it assumes that foundation grants, rather than organizing and political power, will lead to social change. Here I do not argue that social justice organizations should not take foundation grants. In fact, they should, particularly to fund think tanks and other rigorous intellectual engagement with political issues and policy debates. But it is critical that social justice organizations abandon any notion that foundations are not established for a donor's private gain. 7. In recent years, for example, the media has reported on several instances of egregious abuse and mismanagement by our nation's private foundations. Improper spending, lavish travel, self-dealing. 8. And excessive compensation of foundation trustees and executives. In response, leaders of the philanthropic community have ignored or dismissed these wrongful acts as the occasional bad apple in the otherwise pristine philanthropic barrel. Whether because they regard their assets as private or because very few standards, either governmental regulation or market forces, govern their behavior, America's 65,000 private foundations are, for the most part, institutions that are undemocratic and unaccountable to the public. Unlike the government, which is accountable to the public through various channels, most private foundations are governed by a handful of very wealthy people who are affiliated with the foundation by family or business ties. This essay provides a critical perspective on philanthropy and its relationship to democracy. It explores how foundations divert money away from the collective tax base and ways foundations have been undemocratic in their governing practice and in advancing an elitist agenda. While not exhaustive, with this discussion I hope to challenge all of us as participants of a democracy to think critically about the role foundations play in these times of declining government responsibility and growing concentrations of power among the wealthiest corporations and individuals in the United States and in the world. An inequitable system, a common feature of every level of government, from city to state to federal, is the struggle with debilitating deficits. One glaring reason why every level of government is facing a major budget deficit is because the very rich are paying far less in taxes, thanks to successive tax cuts for the wealthiest enacted by President George W. Bush and a Republican-dominated Congress. While the average income of the wealthiest Americans nearly quadrupled between 1992 and 2000, the percentage of taxes they paid did not keep pace. The richest 400 paid an average of 22.3% of their income in federal income tax in 2000, compared with 26.4% in 1992. According to New York Times reporter David K. Johnston, two factors explain most of this decline, according to the IRS: reduced tax rates on long-term capital gains and bigger gifts to charity. Naturally, cuts in capital gains taxes from the sale of an investment such as a home, art, or corporate stock will reduce the taxes paid by the super wealthy, but little is known or understood about the role that charitable giving plays on the declining tax base. Charitable giving, by foundations, corporations, and individuals, has been growing steadily over the decades. According to Giving USA, the yearbook of philanthropy written and researched by the Center of Philanthropy at Indiana University, total charitable giving in 2005 rose 6% from the previous year to more than $260 billion. Although individual contributions accounted for the lion's share, foundation grant-making accounted for 11.5% of the total giving. The Foundation Center, which reported this information, attributed the increase to the growth in the number of foundations and to the steady growth of the stock market in 2004 and 2005. One could hardly dispute the fact that foundation giving largely benefits the wealthy, since the bulk of the money is given to their trustees' alma maters, the opera, and to museums. More, foundation giving represents an alternative to paying high estate taxes, which now surpass 50% on large estates. 10 When public funds are so desperately needed today, why should foundations use public money to forward their own private agendas and protect their own financial and political interests? The very existence of a tax incentive means that charitable expenditures are not purely private. Foundations are made partly with dollars which, were it not for charitable deductions allowed by tax laws, would have become public funds to be allocated through the governmental process under the controlling power of the electorate as a whole. In fact, it is estimated that at least 45% of the $500 billion foundations hold in their coffers belong to the American public. As Harvard University professors Akash Deep and Peter Frumkin note, when a foundation is created today, the burden of lost tax revenue is borne by citizens today in the form of a tax expenditure, 12 with the promise that it will be paid out in future. Here is a hypothetical example of how the creation of foundations diverts money away from our collective tax pool. Our tax laws require that after a person dies, 50% of her or his worth be paid in taxes to the Treasury Department. However, John Doe Millionaire has an option that most ordinary Americans lack. He can avoid taxation by creating the John and Jane Doe Millionaire Foundation. Suppose John Doe Millionaire possesses, for practical purposes, an estate worth $200 million. Upon his death, he would have to pay 50% estate tax, or $100 million, to the U.S. Treasury. Instead, we, the American public, agree to forego the $100 million and, in return, allow him to create the John and Jane Doe Millionaire Foundation to give to charities according to how he sees fit. Due to current tax law, which requires foundations to spend a minimum of 5% of their taxable assets each year on grants and related administrative expenses, the John and Jane Doe Millionaire Foundation must give only $5 million each year. A lack of public accountability. The board and staff of today's foundations are predominantly white, middle-aged, and upper class. According to a 1982 survey from the Council on Foundations, the Foundation Trade Group, 77% of all foundation board members surveyed were men and 96% were white. In 2000, 66% of foundation board members were men and 90% were white. 13 Although a handful of liberal foundations may employ some program officers that are people of color or progressive, it is ultimately foundation trustees who have the final say in the grant-making process. And with few exceptions, foundation trustees are extensions of America's banks, brokerage houses, law firms, universities, and businesses, hardly a broad representation of the American population. Rarely, if ever, will you find a teacher or a working-class person on the board of a foundation. Not only are foundation trustees entrusted with billions of dollars to make grants to advance their agendas, a substantial majority of these elite, who already earn handsome salaries from their professions, actually get paid to serve as trustees on the boards of foundations. It is unheard of to be compensated to serve on the board of a nonprofit organization. Yet, this is standard practice in the majority of America's private foundations. In a 2003 Georgetown University study on trustee fees conducted by Pablo Eisenberg, Chanafa Kambangsa, and myself, we found that 64% of the 176 largest foundations and 79% of smaller foundations we studied paid trustee fees. While compensation varied, the worst cases were the Kimball Art Foundation in Texas, which paid each of its two trustees $750,000, and the Annenberg Foundation, which paid its trustee, Walter Annenberg, $500,000 in 1998. The total amount paid to trustee members by the 238 foundations we studied was almost $45 million in 1998. It is ironic that the burden of our nation's social problems increasingly falls into the laps of foundations, the most elitist institutions in our country, whose boards are almost entirely composed of wealthy people and highly paid professionals, and who, as study after study shows, benefit personally and ideologically from the current social and economic order. Foundation payout. Not only have the bulk of foundations' funds gone to establishment institutions, including their very own trustees, the actual dollars that have gone to social change work, particularly in relation to overall investments and funds, can be characterized as stingy. Another controversial side of philanthropy is the tax policy that governs foundation payout, the term used to describe the annual qualifying distribution of financial assets. Although foundations must pay out 5% of their assets annually, this does not mean they give out 5% of their assets as grants. This 5% includes administrative expenses such as rent and salaries, program-related investments, amounts set aside for future charitable projects, and trustee fees. The payout rate was actually reduced to 5% in 1981 by Congress. As a result, the ratio of grant payouts to assets dropped from 8% in 1981 to 6% by the end of the 1980s and to below 5% in 1997. Given current enormous public needs, courageous leaders from progressive foundations and nonprofits have demanded an increase in the private foundation payout rate to at least 6%, excluding administrative and operating expenses. Yet the majority of foundations have insisted that they cannot afford to pay out more if they hope to conserve their resources for the future, particularly with the emergence of new and unforeseeable social problems due to uncertainty in financial markets. Point 14. Even if foundations want to preserve their assets, study after study tells us foundations can afford to pay more. A 1999 study commissioned by the Council on Foundations found that from 1950 to 1998, foundations could have paid 6.5% annually and still would have grown their assets by 24%. Point 15. A 2001 Harvard University study showed that from 1972 to 1996, the 200 largest foundations yielded an average return of 7.62% annually on their investment returns, while paying out an average of 4.97%. At a 2003 meeting of the Northern California Grantmakers, U.S. Bancorp's Piper Jaffray presented findings which showed that an investment portfolio comprising 70% equity stocks and 30% government bonds earned an inflation-adjusted return of nearly 8% from January 1980 through December 2002.16. In other words, foundations are making money. Why would there be so much resistance to paying out more when the assets of private foundations are actually growing? One theory is that foundations with higher assets generally have more prestige and privilege, and because assets are closely correlated to power, trustees admit a tendency to wanting to grow their foundations. 17. It is also precisely because the investment committees of foundation boards are almost entirely composed of businessmen, whose aims are to steer the foundation's assets toward growth for its own sake, and to support the capitalist system that the board members and their fellow elites benefit from. Point 18. The fact that most private foundations are governed by wealthy white men may partially explain why only 1.9% of all grant dollars in 2002 were designated for Black African Americans. 1.1% for Latinos, 2.9% for the disabled, 1% for the homeless, 0.1% for single parents, and 0.1% for gays and lesbians. 19 The majority of grants go to universities, hospitals, research, and the arts, while barely 1.7% goes to fund civil rights and social action. According to a new National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy report, obviously, many of these board members who often set general programmatic goals for foundations and give final approval of grants do not reflect the constituencies that would most benefit from progressive social and political changes. 20 It's about time the American public takes a hard look at who governs foundations and where the money does and does not go. This has led Pablo Eisenberg, the nation's leading critic of philanthropy, to assert, "It is as though philanthropy exists for its own sake rather than for the communities it is intended to serve." 21 Advancing an elite agenda through philanthropy. The following three examples reflect both the potential and the limits of philanthropy to create large-scale social change. The first story focuses on conservative foundations and how they strategically directed funds towards shaping ideology to protect the wealthy. The second story outlines the disastrous results of efforts by liberal foundations to advance their elitist agenda to solve global hunger. The final story is about the world's richest man using philanthropy to address both serious global problems and to improve his public image. The success of conservative philanthropy. The well-heeled and strategic philanthropy of conservative foundations have successfully moved national ideology, and hence policy, toward the right. As a result, conservative issues, such as downsizing federal government and increasing states' rights, free market capitalism and deregulation, individual property rights, and traditional values, like opposing gay civil rights, have become central to national policy debates. In a groundbreaking 1997 NCRP study of 12 prominent conservative foundations, Sally Covington documented the impact these foundations had on politics and society. She found that they controlled over $1.1 billion in assets and awarded $300 million in grants from 1992 to 1994. Of that, they directed $210 million to the following: $88.9 million to support conservative scholarships and programs by training the next generation of conservative thinkers and activists in universities and law and business schools, $79.2 million to build and strengthen a national infrastructure of think tanks and advocacy groups, like the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, $116.3 million to finance alternative media outlets, media watchdog groups, and public television and radio, $10.5 million to assist conservative pro-market law firms and law clinics, $19.3 million to support a network of regional and state-based think tanks and advocacy institutions, and $5.4 million to groups transforming the views and practices of religious and philanthropic leaders. 22 The strategic funding by conservative foundations to build a political infrastructure testifies to the enormous power held by foundations. As Covington observes, it is not simply the volume of money being invested that merits serious attention, but the way in which these investments have helped to build the power and influence of the conservative policy movement. These 12 funders directed a majority of their grants to organizations and programs that pursue an overtly ideological agenda based on industrial and environmental deregulation, the privatization of government services, deep reductions in federal anti-poverty spending, and the transfer of authority and responsibility for social welfare from the national government to the charitable sector and state and local government. 23 These foundations were effective because they focused their grant-making programs on shaping ideas by building strong institutions and granting general operating support, as opposed to project-specific grants. They also funded state and local-level advocacy, institutions, and intellectuals that generated conservative ideas, and a broad array of institutions employing diverse strategies to advance a conservative agenda. But, perhaps most important, these foundations have been funding their grantees' work for the long haul, some for even 2 decades or more. 24 According to Jeff Crehealy, they also had a national political party that was crafting a strong identity as well as a clear statement of values. In contrast to their liberal counterparts, these foundations were not afraid to take risks or face potential government retribution. In contrast, their liberal counterparts have received only 1/4 as much support to build a political infrastructure to challenge the prevailing conservative ideology. For example, Covington found that in 1995, conservative multi-issue policy institutions such as the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Free Congress Research and Education Foundation, the Cato Institute, and Citizens for a Sound Economy collectively had a revenue base of over $77 million. In contrast, groups that might be considered their progressive counterparts, the Institute for Policy Studies, the Economic Policy Institute, Citizens for Tax Justice, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the 20th Century Fund, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, OMB Watch, and the Center for Community Change had only $18.6 million at their disposal. 25 Without long-term financial support, it is almost impossible to be an aggressive, bold institution that is positioned to realize ideas into action. Furthermore, although large liberal foundations have far more assets than conservative foundations, the latter have been so successful because they have been strategic. As social programs are defunded, many mainstream and progressive organizations consider providing direct services to disadvantaged and disenfranchised populations and communities as their priority, not advocating policy change. 26 Clearly, conservative foundations have been successful. Their ideological platform now shapes public policy and debate today. Their agenda includes less government, lower taxes for the wealthy, restrictions on the right to sue, and a free market unfettered by regulations or public interest concerns. They have led the assault against affirmative action and abortion, and have aggressively mobilized for the privatization of Medicare and Social Security. As a new NCRP report, Axis of Ideology, Conservative Foundations and Public Policy, warns, Bush has also worked to permanently repeal the estate tax by 2009, which would be devastating to the public interest, since the tax generates $45 billion in revenue for public and charitable needs, and its repeal would only benefit the few wealthiest Americans. 27 The report also finds that conservative foundations already have an infrastructure in place, now more wealth, and a successful two-pronged approach of funding policy ideas at both the state and national levels. 28 For example, the leading right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, reaped $28,569,700 in grants from conservative foundations from 1999 to 2001. With this support, it launched the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, which has produced publications such as Support and Defend, How Congress Can Save the Constitution from the Supreme Court, and In Defense of Marriage. The Heritage Foundation, in its 2002 annual report, boasts that its experts were seen on national television more in that year than in the entire 1990s. It has also invested in training the next generation of conservative leaders through formalizing congressional internships and building a 200-seat auditorium, conference facilities, and office space, and housing for interns. 29 Unintended consequences. Right-wing foundations are not alone in strategically directing funds to achieve their goals. Liberal foundations are just as culpable as their right-wing counterparts in advancing a seemingly pragmatic agenda with tremendous effects on societies and the environment. In what is perceived as the single largest and longest-lasting initiative of American philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation, and later the Ford Foundation, bankrolled the massive global restructuring of agriculture known as the Green Revolution. The ostensible goal was to end world hunger by transferring Western scientific agricultural techniques to less developed countries to increase crop yields. In just 50 years, the Green Revolution increased food production substantially, but it also permanently transformed agriculture and destroyed the livelihoods of millions of farmers and villages that had been in existence for hundreds of years. Although the stated intention of the officers, trustees, and scientists of the Rockefeller Foundation was to solve the seemingly intractable problem of global hunger, investigative journalist Mark Dowie presents a parallel story of elites that were just as motivated to curb population growth in the global south and stave off radical communist insurgency. The Green Revolution was seeded in 1941 in Mexico, which was a fertile place and time for a Rockefeller-funded agricultural science project. Mexico had a new president, Avelo Camacho, who was pro-U.S. and favored private property rights. Although private land ownership and free market principles replaced former President Lázaro Cárdenas's socialist policies, the political instability in Mexico and the region caused by massive food shortages continued to concern the Rockefeller Foundation. Dowie writes, throughout the region, the Rockefeller family's massive investments made them vulnerable to the kind of instability that results from a hungry populace. 30. In other words, a program to end hunger was wielded as a tool to suppress a communist revolt. By 1943, researchers in the Rockefeller Foundation's Mexican agriculture program were teaching Mexican and other Latin American agronomists techniques to grow massive quantities of food by employing the tools of the Green Revolution: pesticides, fertilizers, and other ecologically damaging techniques. Point 31, while the funders promoted their agenda as a humanitarian effort. The Rockefeller Foundation archives show that Cold War geopolitics and the fear of population growth motivated the trustees at least as much as feeding the masses. Mexico and India, which were enduring political instability and burgeoning populations, were primed for a mass communist insurgency. The Malthusian 32 philosophy that overpopulation caused hunger was the prevailing belief among elites at that time, and was the underlying ideology that drove foundations to promote the Green Revolution. The International Development Advisory Board, chaired by Nelson Rockefeller, recommended that the IDAB cooperate with countries like Mexico and India in a vigorous food production drive that would break the back of famine and hunger, and thereby stabilize their governments. Point 33. This ignored the fact that poverty was often the result of tightly concentrated economic power that limited people's access to land and purchasing power. Point 34. The Green Revolution did produce record-breaking amounts of food, but with tremendous ecological and social consequences, such as the depletion of soils around the world with the application of pesticides and fertilizers, and the massive displacement of subsistence farmers that accompanied the industrialization of agriculture. As Dowie notes, 30 years ago, when the Green Revolution was still germinating, there were fewer than 1 million hungry people on the planet. The Green Revolution may have yielded extremely productive 35 quantities of food, but the fact that over 800 million people around the world face hunger daily amid overabundant food supplies can hardly be considered a victory. Although the Green Revolution was largely promoted and financed by governments, private foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation played a pivotal role in advancing technological solutions to problems that threatened elite control, political insurgency, and population growth. Doing good and good PR foundations have also used their money to improve their public image and deflect scrutiny from the people and corporations that created them. Take, for example, founder of Microsoft and software giant Bill Gates, who is combining doing good with smart public relations. Gates and his wife, Melinda, are co-trustees of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Through the Gates Foundation, which has more assets than any other foundation in the world, the chairman of the world's largest corporation, 36, spends almost $6 billion each year vaccinating Africans from disease. Point 37, it is estimated that through his philanthropy, the Gates Foundation has saved more than 100,000 lives. But let's think about this for a minute. What do vaccines have in common with Microsoft and its software and hardware products? One thing they share in common is that their patents are protected by the trade-related intellectual property rights rules of the World Trade Organization. Point 38, according to investigative reporter Greg Palast. TRIPS gives Gates a hammerlock on computer operating systems worldwide, legally granting him the kind of monopoly the robber barons of yore could only dream of. But TRIPS, the rule which helps Gates rule, also bars African governments from buying AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis medicine at cheap market prices. 39. In other words, with his left hand, Bill Gates spends billions of dollars through the Gates Foundation to vaccinate the millions of Africans dying of AIDS. Meanwhile, with his right hand, his foundation has invested $200 million in the very drug companies stopping the shipment of low-cost AIDS drugs to Africa. 40. Conclusion. Holding foundations accountable historically, foundations have financed civil society organizations that have challenged the excesses of government and corporate power. But they have also been a means for the elite to preserve their wealth and power. In our organizing for better government and cleaner corporations, we must also press for more democracy and philanthropy. Since foundations and the demand for their funds are not about to magically disappear, I think we need to start somewhere with an eye toward a long-term plan. I am not about to offer any magical solutions nor specific policy prescriptions. Point 41, however, I do want to close this essay with some thoughts to hopefully initiate some action. First, foundations can and should pay out more of their assets to charities. In 2003, a bipartisan bill in Congress introduced by Roy Blunt, Republican from Missouri, and Harold Ford, Jr., Democrat from Tennessee, would have required foundations to distribute 5% of their assets annually, all in grants. The legislation would have prohibited foundations from counting administrative costs like rent and staff salaries against the 5%. This amount is still highway robbery, and as Pablo Eisenberg has so eloquently put it, foundations should accept a slight payout increase as a good deal. It's a better deal than they deserve. Unfortunately, the nation's largest foundations mounted an extensive lobbying campaign to defeat this provision of the legislation. The hundreds of thousands of dollars that they spent on this self-defense lobbying could be counted ironically toward their 5% payout. On a related matter, foundations need to be more closely regulated by the state and federal governments. As Pablo Eisenberg notes in his book Challenges for Nonprofits and Philanthropy, The Courage to Change, it should be clear by now that self-regulation by foundations has not worked. Public accountability and the eradication of abuses will be achieved only if state and federal governments do an adequate job of oversight. While I agree with Eisenberg that government regulation of foundation practices is about the only mechanism to tie the growing control of social change work and more by foundations, I also believe that foundations can implement some cultural changes to their institutions to diversify their boards and staff to be more representative of the American public and more effectively address critical issues today. As part of a broader vision for social change, we must organize to make foundations accountable to the larger public. Mandating that community leaders, working-class men and women, and people of color serve on their boards to redirect grants so these constituents receive a bigger piece of the grant pie. Last but not least, let's set the record straight by speaking the truth. Foundations are created not only from wealth that was made off the backs of hardworking people, but from a social compact they accepted as a result of major tax benefits their donors received. Individuals who have dedicated their lives to working for social and economic justice need a major paradigm shift and recognize that foundation money, often the result of exploited wealth, is public money. In a meeting of the trusted inner circle of the Open Society Institute, a private foundation started by the international businessman George Soros, there was a protracted argument that kept the group's discussion going in circles. Finally, an impatient George Soros exerted his authority, slammed down his fists, and said, "This is my money. We will do it my way." This interjection silenced the room, except for a courageous junior member who raised his voice in objection to tell Mr. Soros, "No, it isn't." The young heretic went on to say, "Half of it is ours. If you hadn't placed that money in OSI or another of your 25 foundations, sir, about half of it would be in the Treasury." 42 Well, the courageous young staffer is no longer there, but hopefully Soros got the message. Perhaps we will all get the message too and have the courage to reform American philanthropy and democracy.